This is Beyond the Business, Weekly Digest.
This week offered another clear signal that extreme weather is no longer a background risk. It is an operational factor. Severe storm systems affected both the Atlantic coast and the Med Sea, bringing strong winds, heavy rainfall, and high waves. What matters is not only the weather itself, but the way it's translated into infrastructure disruptions, delayed logistics, and economic impact across multiple regions. This week, the Atlantic reminded everyone of something the system still prefers to treat as an exception. Weather is no longer background noise, it is an operational constraint. Large parts of the North Atlantic experienced prolonged periods of heavy weather. Strong winds, high waves, and unstable conditions forced vessels to delay departures, remain at anchor, or slow down routes. In several areas, port operations were limited not because infrastructure failed, but because operating under normal schedules became unsafe. This is an important distinction. Nothing broke in a dramatic sense. The system simply stopped moving at full speed. Shipping companies made a rational decision: wait rather than risk crews, cargo, and vessels. But waiting has a cost. Every day a vessel remains idle, every port window that closes, every delayed departure creates friction that propagates through the entire supply chain. Containers stay in port longer than planned. Connections between sea, rail, and road desynchronize. Delivery windows shift. Inventories that were calibrated for normal transit times suddenly become misaligned. This is how disruption actually happens today, not through spectacular failures, but through accumulated pauses. The Atlantic block of this week was not about losses, it was about delay. And delay, when multiplied across routes and weeks, becomes an economic factor. At the same time, similar dynamics were visible in parts of the Mediterranean Sea. Severe weather affected coastal infrastructure, port access, and marine operations across several regions. And again, the key feature was not destruction but restriction. Operations slowed down, movements were postponed, schedules were adjusted in real time. The Mediterranean often feels more protected in public perception: shorter routes, denser port networks, and proximity to markets. But this week showed that volatility does not respect geography. When conditions deteriorate, even well connected systems lose flexibility. What matters here is not comparing severity between basins, it is just recognizing the pattern. When weather becomes unpredictable, infrastructure does not fail immediately. It enters a defensive mode. Safety margins widen, standbys becomes normal, and the cost of that standby is carried by the supply chain. Delayed cargo affects manufacturing inputs. Delayed deliveries affects retailers and distributors. Delayed movements affect labor planning and energy use across logistics hubs. None of this shows up as a single headline number, but all of it adds friction to the economy. The Mediterranean block was not an isolated event. It mirrored the Atlantic. Different sea, same system response. What these two basins show together is something deeper than a weather story. Climate volatility is no longer a future risk to supply chains. It is a present operational condition. The global logistics system was designed for efficiency and speed and optimizes for movement. But when the weather volatility increases, the system is forced to optimize for endurance instead. That shift has consequences. Ports need more standby capacity, fleets need more buffer time, infrastructure needs reinforcement, not just expansion. So supply chains need contingency planning, not as an exception, but as a baseline. And this is where the real cost appears, not in the storms themselves, but in the permanent adaptation they require. If no structural changes are made, these pauses will become more frequent delays will be compound, insurance costs will rise. Maintenance budgets will also grow, and the burden will increasingly fall on coastal regions, critical infrastructure, and essential supply routes. This is no longer about reacting to bad weeks, it is about accepting that volatility is now part of the operating environment. The question is no longer whether climate impacts supply chains, the question is how much friction the system can absorb before resilience becomes more expensive than redesign. Alongside extreme weather, global supply chains are now operating under another constraint: geopolitical pressure around key maritime corridors. This isn't about headlines or politics, it's about how uncertainty changes behavior long before anything actually breaks. Right now, several critical maritime regions are under tension at the same time, and these are the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and the Eastern Mediterranean. None of them are closed. Ships are still moving, trade continues, ports are operating. But the system is no longer flexible. In this region, supply chains are working inside a tighter risk frame. Routes become more cautious, decisions become more conservative, operations prioritize safety and predictability over speed and efficiency. That's how bottlenecks appear without closures. The Persian Gulf remains a core source of global energy flows. Any increase in perceived risk that doesn't need an actual disruption to have an effect. It immediately shows up downstream in pricing, insurance, routing choices, and reserve margins. The Red Sea and Bab el Mandeb are one of the narrowest links between Asia and Europe. When uncertainty rises, even small delays or rerouting considerations start to stack up across schedules and supply plans. The Suez Canal works as a compression point for time being. Its real value isn't just capacity but reliability. When reliability weakens, the cost isn't dramatic shutdowns, it's the loss of options. The East Mediterranean adds another layer. Energy infrastructure, shipping routes, and regional tension overlap there. Under pressure, even normal operations require extra monitoring and more cautious planning. So, what connects all these regions is not disruption, but pressure. Supply chains don't usually fail suddenly, they stiffen first. They lose elasticity, they lose spare capacity, they lose the ability to absorb problems somewhere else. When multiple corridors operate under constant uncertainty, at the same time, global logistics enters a narrow operating mode. Everything still works, but only just. In that state, delays don't come from one big event. They come from accumulated caution. Ships wait longer, routes become less direct, buffers grow, schedules slip quietly without headlines. The impact is subtle, but real. Cargo arrives later, inventory cycles stretch, infrastructure runs closer to its limits. And the system becomes far more exposed to secondary shocks, weather, technical issues, labor constraints, because its margin for error is already gone. That's the defining condition today. Not collapse, not closure, but compression. Global trade is moving through corridors that are technically open but permanently tense. And when geopolitical pressure overlaps with the climate disruption, the system changes behavior long before any official crisis begins. That's the bottleneck most people never see. If you step back and look at everything together, the weather disruption, the pressure on shipping corridors, the delays, the standby time, one pattern becomes very clear. What we are dealing with is no longer a sequence of isolated events, it's a condition. Storms are no longer rare interruptions, geopolitical tension is no longer an exception. Delays are no longer temporary failures. They are becoming part of the operating environment. And the most important consequence of that is not even economic loss in the short term. It's the way the system reacts. When routes are delayed, ships wait. When ports slow down, engines stay running. When supply chains pause, infrastructure doesn't stop. It idles. and idle systems still burn fuel, still emit, and still add load. So while we are responding to disruption, we are often reinforcing the very pressures we are trying to manage. That is the quiet paradox underneath this week's events. We talk about resilience, recovery, and continuity, but in practice, much of the response today is reactive. We absorb shocks, we delay deliveries, we reshuffle schedules, and we move on without fundamentally adjusting how the system prepares for recurring stress. And that's the real signal coming from these disruptions. The question is no longer whether climate volatility or geopolitical tension will affect supply chains. They already do. The question is whether adaptation remains an afterthought or becomes a core layer of how infrastructure, logistics, and trade are planned in the first place. Because if conditions like these are no longer exceptional, then planning as if they are will keep producing the same outcome: more standby, more inefficiency, more emissions, and more pressure on the system that are already stretched. This doesn't call for panic or dramatic claims, it calls for a different level of attention. Not just reacting faster, but planning differently, not just fixing damage, but adjusting expectations, and not just moving cargo, but understanding the environment it moves through. That's where this week really leaves us. And not with a single event, but with a reminder. The operating context has changed, and adaptation is no longer optional. That's all for this week.